The mysterious background of Colorado. Nestled within the heart of the Rocky Mountains, Colorado has always been a place of wonder, adventure, and mystery. Known for its breathtaking landscapes, deep canyons, and towering peaks, it's no surprise that this state has captured the imagination of explorers, nature enthusiasts, and storytellers alike. From its serene alpine lakes to its dense forest trails, Colorado's natural beauty often seems untouched by the chaos of urban life. But beneath the stunning vistas and soothing quiet of its remote wilderness, there lies a slightly darker reputation, one that has puzzled, intrigued, and frightened its residents for decades. Colorado, for all its charm, has always had an air of mystery. Its history is rich with stories of early settlers who braved harsh conditions to carve out a life in the wild. They spoke of disappearing miners, campfire tales of vengeful spirits, and rumors of hidden crimes buried beneath the snow. Over time, these tales were written off as folklore, stories meant to frighten children or liven up a campfire. But by the turn of the 20th century, as communities grew and began sprawling deeper into the wilderness, a disturbing trend began to emerge, a series of unsolved disappearances and unexplained deaths. The Midwestern state's unforgiving terrain became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offered isolation, the kind that brought solace to some and mischief to others. On the other, it provided the perfect cover for those with sinister intentions. The dense forests, sprawling plains, and hidden trails meant that someone or something could easily disappear without a trace. This reputation for danger wasn't just limited to ghost stories either. Historians note that as far back as the late 1800s, there were whispers about curious settlers or lone drifters vanishing near the Rockies. For years, Colorado was dismissed as the place where people simply got lost. Now flash forward to the modern era, and you'll find that this sinister undercurrent still lingers. The picturesque towns of Colorado bear unmatched beauty, yet their idyllic exteriors mask a truth many locals know but rarely speak about: just how easy it is to become invisible amidst the endless miles of untouched nature. Residents of small towns like Estes Park or Leadville often talk casually of how the wilderness beyond their backyards can swallow more than just hikers. Secrets, too, are often hidden away among the thick forests and silent cliffs. And while tales of Bigfoot sightings or haunted train tunnels provide a whimsical edge to the state's gothic reputation, the darker truths live in the reports of unsolved crimes that continually haunt Colorado's law enforcement. Take for example its numerous ghost towns, relics of the state's mining boom during the gold rush era. Today, these abandoned settlements sit desolate, frequently visited by curious tourists but shrouded in eerie stillness. Stories of strange figures lurking in the windows of old saloons or unearthly cries echoing through ruins are passed down generations. But these are just ghost stories, aren't they? Mystery seems to cling to Colorado as tightly as fresh snowfall in January. By the 1990s, however, an entirely new chapter of Colorado's murky history began to unfold, bringing a chilling reality that no ghost story could rival. A string of disappearances started cropping up near some of these picturesque locations: quiet neighborhoods, winding hiking trails, and quiet mountainside towns. Often they involved individuals seemingly cut from different walks of life: students, hikers, travelers. On occasion even locals who knew the terrain better than anyone fell victim. Law enforcement teams, both local and federal, began a heart-rending campaign of searching valleys, caves, and yet-to-be-mapped trails, but their work was often thwarted by the size and complexity of Colorado's geography. "That was the thing about Colorado," said a retired officer from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department years later. "The wilderness didn't just keep people away, it kept answers away too." His words would soon ring prophetic. During this tumultuous period, the Rocky Mountain backdrop evolved from a place of adventure and natural wonder to a canvas for unthinkable crime scenes. Some called it unlucky, others whispered of something almost supernatural: a curse seeded into Colorado's very soil. To the average outsider, Colorado still resembles a dream. Ski resorts like Aspen boast lively crowds in the winter, college towns like Boulder remain hubs of activity, and Denver, the mile-high city itself, is bustling with energy. But these urban oases, while dynamic, account for just a fraction of the state's 104,000 square miles. Outside of the bustling towns are expanses of quiet, unpoliced wilderness that seem to stretch on forever. It is here, beyond the gaze of postcard photographers and casual travelers, that a cold and disquieting truth takes hold. Even in the most beautiful places, the human potential for evil looms, biding its time beneath the trees. Colorado's isolated yet open landscape is paradoxical in nature. Its emptiness is a blank slate for dreams, but also for untraceable nightmarish deeds. The state, through no fault of its own, became an unwilling character in some of its most heinous crimes. And so, the question lingered in the air, haunting locals and investigators alike. Was Colorado a place where the land concealed secrets, or did it quietly create them? To this day, some residents can't help but look out at the endless tree lines of the Rockies and wonder what, or who, might be hiding in plain sight. The first body. A mysterious clue emerges. It was a crisp fall morning in 1995 when an early hiker meandering along Boulder Canyon made a stomach-churning discovery that would forever change the perception of safety in Colorado's serene wilderness. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the deep pine woods illuminating the golden autumn leaves, the serenity was shattered by the sight of something unnatural, a human body lying among the rocks in the canyon, lifeless and disheveled. For even the most seasoned outdoorsman, the scene was jarring. The woman appeared to have been there for weeks or longer. Her face was bruised, her wrists bore ligature marks, and there were clear signs of foul play. She'd been strangled, possibly with a rope or cord, and disturbingly, her belongings were nowhere to be found. No purse, no ID, no jewelry. She was, to the authorities who arrived hastily that morning, a ghost, a nameless victim left behind to rot in what was supposed to be a sanctuary of peace. The crime scene offered little in terms of immediate answers. The harsh elements of the Colorado wilderness, cold nights and curious animals, had reduced the potential for forensic evidence to a frustratingly minimal level. The canyon, long celebrated for its breathtaking views and rock-climbing hotspots, had suddenly taken on a new identity, that of a crime scene. One investigator, Officer Katie Burnett, described the scene vividly years later in a documentary interview. It wasn't just any body dump. Whoever did this wasn't in a rush. The victim was placed in an area that's hard to stumble upon unless you know where to look. The killer knew the terrain, and it felt intentional, as if it was some kind of warped statement, Burnett said, her voice still tinged with frustration and sadness. The post-mortem report confirmed what most of the law enforcement team already suspected. The woman had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. She was in her 20s, roughly 5'6", with long chestnut hair. Disturbingly, there were faint traces of dirt and abrasions on her bare feet, suggesting she had been forced to walk barefoot through rough terrain, her captor leading her through the wilderness. The forensic team estimated her time of death to be approximately 4 weeks before her discovery, but a closer window was impossible due to the element's effects on the body. For weeks, investigators tried to piece together her identity. Local missing person databases were combed through, but no matches surfaced. Flyers were distributed around nearby towns and cities from Boulder to Fort Collins and as far as Denver, calling for leads or identification of the Jane Doe. Photos of her clothing, a plain beige blouse and torn jeans, were shown on local TV stations, and her facial reconstruction sketch was plastered in newspapers, yet no one came forward. No one claimed her. To her killer, she was disposable. To Colorado's police, she became a haunting riddle. Then there was the most chilling detail, the positioning of her body. Her arms were crossed over her chest, as though staged in an almost ritualistic way. Burnett and her colleagues debated endlessly whether this was a deliberate act by the killer to convey some sort of twisted message or merely a coincidence. This was no casual crime of opportunity, she told reporters later. This was something planned, methodical. Compounding the frustration, the initial investigation hit roadblock after roadblock. Boulder Canyon's rugged backcountry with its countless trails and isolated spots made retracing the killer's movements daunting. Trained dogs struggled to pick up viable scents after weeks of environmental contamination. With no witnesses, no suspects, and no identity for their victim, the case grew cold before even gaining momentum. But the shadow of the first body didn't fade. It loomed over the community, a ghostly reminder that the safest state to hike wasn't as safe as it seemed. Residents swapped hushed whispers about the body in the canyon. Speculation flourished. Was it the work of a local drifter, a spurned lover, or something far more sinister, more calculated? Then came a detail that sent chills down the spines of local law enforcement. Beneath the woman's right thumbnail, the forensic team found a faint trace of something almost invisible: skin cells. It wasn't enough to identify a suspect, especially in the technological limitations of 1995. But it was a clue, albeit as fragile as a wisp of smoke. Detective Frank Harris, a grizzled veteran nearing retirement, became obsessed with the case. He spent weeks retracing every inch of the trail leading to the crime scene. This wasn't just random, Harris declared during a meeting with his team. Someone out there is watching us flail around thinking they got away with it, and right now, they're right. That obsession would lead him to uncover subtle patterns. Stories of unsolved disappearances, all with eerie similarities to Jane Doe's case. A week-long visit to the neighboring jurisdictions revealed disjointed police reports filed over the years of campers vanishing into thin air, hikers disappearing off map trails, and cars abandoned near backcountry parking lots, bodies never found. By 1996, the Boulder Canyon Jane Doe, as media outlets referred to her, became a grim emblem of the state's unsolved mysteries. She represented more than a tragic murder. She was a reminder that the wilderness, as majestic as it may seem, could also harbor unimaginable darkness. Years later, in 2003, advances in DNA technology promised a fresh lead. A skin sample, too degraded to be processed in the 90s, was re-examined and submitted to the national database. Investigators hoped for just one match that could crack the case wide open, but the result came back frustratingly empty, sending the case back into the cold file archives. Little did the detectives know, the discovery of that first body in Boulder Canyon was only the tip of a chilling iceberg. Over the next 20 years, more victims would follow, their stories adding to a mosaic of terror that would keep Colorado's law enforcement grasping for answers. The killer, it seemed, wasn't done yet. A string of crimes in remote areas. By the late 1990s, the gruesome discovery of the Boulder Canyon Jane Doe had unsettled Colorado's sense of safety. But what began as an isolated tragedy soon spiraled into something far more menacing. A series of eerily similar murders across the state's vast and isolated wilderness. Now the question wasn't whether this was the work of a lone killer, it was how and why these killings were escalating in both scope and frequency. Colorado's remote areas, once considered havens for hikers and adventurers, were quickly becoming hotspots for terror. Over the next 3 years, at least 5 more bodies were discovered in different rugged locations near Colorado Springs and beyond. Like a terrible script on repeat, the victims shared strikingly similar fates. Young women, most in their 20s, found strangled to death and dumped near isolated trails, gorges, or wooded clearings. On the surface, they appeared to have nothing in common. Some were locals, others out-of-state drifters, and at least 2 were sex workers. Yet the gruesome details of their deaths defied coincidence. As if mocking the authorities, the killer left only one undeniable signature at every crime scene: the methodical use of strangulation. In most cases, ligature marks indicated the use of a rope, cord, or even makeshift tools like twine. There was no sign of robbery, little evidence of prolonged violence, and no clear motive to explain the murders. Victims' personal belongings were almost always missing, erased as thoroughly as their lives. One particularly troubling discovery came in the summer of 1997. A pair of hikers near Phantom Canyon stumbled upon the remains of a woman buried shallowly beneath loose rocks. The body was degraded to the point of near unrecognizability, but signs of trauma told a clear story. Marks around the neck, broken hyoid bone, and dirt scuffed beneath her fingernails suggested she died trying to claw her way free of her captor. Her identity would later be confirmed as a college student who had been reported missing 6 months earlier while visiting her boyfriend in Colorado Springs. Law enforcement remained baffled. The randomness of the locations, not all near major trails and many too obscure for casual visitors, implied painstaking planning. Captain Harold Mitchell of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation summed up the growing dread at a press conference held in late '97. "This isn't opportunistic," he said, gripping the podium like it was the only solid thing in the room. "This is patterned behavior. This individual is hunting." The chilling reality was that investigators not only didn't know who the killer was, they didn't know how they chose their targets. Unlike the publicized serial killers of the previous decades, where victimology often held the key, here, no such pattern emerged. Women from different walks of life randomly vanished after mundane activities like hiking, driving through back roads, or even stopping for gas at rural stations. They didn't travel in predictable circles or follow dangerous routines. There was no apparent common thread, except for one: their vulnerability in Colorado's vast secluded landscapes. For Linda Dawson, a mother in her late 40s, life in Monument, the small town she'd called home for 3 decades, was irrevocably changed after her daughter vanished on a morning jog. The flyers she posted throughout Colorado bore the familiar yet haunting message: last seen wearing running shoes, black leggings, and a blue windbreaker. Please call with any information. But no calls came. Weeks dragged into months, and the search efforts dwindled alongside her hope. "This place used to feel safe," she told one local news station. "Now I can't even look at the trees without wondering what's hiding between them." Behind closed doors, FBI analysts and local detectives debated whether the emerging crime wave pointed toward a single individual. Some theorized a drifter, someone with an intimate knowledge of Colorado's rugged terrain. Others suspected the culprit was a local who blended seamlessly with small-town life, allowing them to strike without being noticed. There were moments of hope, such as when a convenience store's security camera captured grainy footage of a young brunette who would later become one of the victims. Tragically, her police report described being approached by a man offering to help fix a flat tire. That was the last anyone ever saw of her alive. Serial killers in the United States were nothing new, but this one seemed to adapt with horrifying precision. While other notorious offenders left traces behind, cigarettes, fingerprints, or careless souvenirs, the Colorado killer operated like a ghost. Search and rescue teams combing the wilderness for clues found only whispers of evidence: strands of hair tangled in tree bark, tire tracks that disappeared where dirt became rock, odd impressions in loose soil as though something heavy had been dragged. Each clue promised more than it delivered, leading investigators into dead ends and false hopes. The lack of physical evidence didn't just frustrate investigators, it made them question their assumptions. Could more than one person be involved? Was the killer intentionally targeting specific areas to exploit weak oversight? Or was this someone who simply stumbled upon these remote locations by chance? A predator rehearsing their methods and growing bolder with every act? For us, it was a nightmare, recalled Detective Maria Ortega, who worked on the string of cases during that time. We'd think we had a lead, and then the terrain, these endless forests and canyons, would swallow it up. It felt like the very landscape was complicit in hiding this monster from us. As the late 1990s came to a close, Colorado's idyllic image as a natural getaway was beginning to tarnish. Tourists hesitated to explore overlooked trails, locals avoided wandering too far from main roads. Still, the bodies kept turning up, and the killer's voice, though silent, rang loud and clear. Colorado's wilderness was their playground, and they were far from finished. The difficult journey of law enforcement. For law enforcement in Colorado, the late 1990s represented one of the most challenging periods in the state's modern history. The cases of missing women piling up like unsolvable riddles, all pointing toward an elusive predator who seemed to vanish into thin air after every kill. Investigators were not just hunting for a killer, they were battling against time, nature, and a sense of collective fear that was spreading like wildfire through the local communities. The investigation began in earnest as a collaboration between local sheriff's offices, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, and eventually the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. A task force was formed, codenamed Trail Hunter, a team of seasoned detectives, forensic experts, and field agents all brought together with one purpose: finding the person responsible for terrorizing the rugged wilderness. But from the outset, the task force was hamstrung by the very terrain they were working in. The Rocky Mountains, with their endless maze of trails, dense forests, narrow ravines, and hidden caves, made tracking the killer almost impossible. Every new body discovered presented the same challenges. The crime scenes were remote, the evidence scarce, and the overwhelming wilderness served as a perfect accomplice for a murderer who knew how to navigate its secrets. A lack of evidence and mounting frustration. The early days of the investigation were marked by high expectations. Officers combed through the locations where bodies were found, sifting dirt for fibers, collecting whatever DNA material they could find, and bringing in tracker dogs. But the results were disheartening. Heavy snowfall and unpredictable mountain weather destroyed crucial evidence at several scenes, leaving investigators with little more than theories. "It felt like we were chasing shadows," said Captain Harold Mitchell, a veteran investigator with the CBI. "We'd find a piece of rope here, a tire track there, but nothing ever led us to a solid suspect. It was like the killer knew exactly what we'd be looking for, and how to hide it." One of the cases seemed particularly promising. A partial boot print was found near one of the bodies, a deep, clear impression in the mud. To the investigators, it was like a tiny glimpse of hope amid the overwhelming darkness. Photos of the print were sent to forensic analysts across the state, and manufacturers were contacted to trace the specific tread pattern. Days turned into weeks, but nothing ever came of it. The boot print, like so many other pieces of evidence, led to a dead end. Coordinating across counties, the strain of teamwork. Complications were further exacerbated by the jurisdictional challenges. Colorado's terrain sprawls across different counties, each with its own law enforcement agencies and procedures. Once the murders were connected as the work of a potential serial killer, interagency collaboration became critical, but not without its challenges. Small-town sheriff's offices, often ill-equipped to handle complex murder investigations, relied heavily on state and federal support, leading to delays and logistical bottlenecks. There were times when we felt like we were speaking different languages, admitted FBI agent Scott Hanley, who served as the federal liaison to the task force. Sheriff's deputies were used to handling bar fights and stolen trucks, not the kind of predator who could dump bodies across miles of untouched wilderness. It took a lot of effort just to get everyone on the same page. The public's role, pressure and panic. As the media got wind of the unfolding horror, the story quickly made national headlines. Headlines like "The Colorado Strangler" and "Rocky Mountain Predator" splashed across major newspapers, amplifying fear among locals. Panic set in, and tips began pouring in at an overwhelming rate. Some were helpful, locals reporting unusual behavior from drifters or strangers they'd spotted near trailheads, but many were wild accusations that wasted valuable time. "We didn't just have to find the killer," said Maria Ortega, a detective from the task force. "We had to calm a community that was convinced they were next. People refused to hike anymore. Small-town rumors about husband suspects turned friends and families against each other. It was chaos, pure and simple." Even well-intentioned citizens sometimes made the situation worse. Volunteers offered to help search the surrounding trails, but this inevitably led to accidental trampling on potential evidence. A group of amateur sleuths once alerted local police about a hidden campsite they believed belonged to the killer, only for it to turn out to be left over from homeless hikers years before. Jurisdictional red tape and budget strains. Adding to the frustrations were the mounting costs of the investigation. Search teams required helicopters to transport personnel to remote sites. Forensic testing costs skyrocketed with every new DNA sample submitted, and over time pay for officers pushed smaller towns to their financial limits. State and federal agencies pitched in, but the lack of immediate results left local governments questioning the effort. Was it worth it? Sheriff Marcus Grady of Jefferson County recalled the financial pressures vividly. "People don't see the hidden costs. Every footprint cast, every hour a helicopter spends hovering over a canyon, every meal we have to feed an extra team of investigators. I had residents asking me if it was worth bankrupting the county to chase someone we might never catch. And you can't tell them, yes, it's worth it, when we've got nothing to show." A breakthrough that wasn't. In early 1998, the task force believed they had their first breakthrough. A man named Alan Whitford, a nomadic drifter and former convict, was brought in for questioning after being spotted acting suspiciously near a campground where one of the bodies was discovered. He matched the profile. His criminal record included violence against women, and he had an encyclopedic knowledge of wilderness survival. For the first time, officers felt they were closing in, but after weeks of surveillance and interrogation, Whitford was eliminated as a suspect. His alibis held up for each of the murders, and the DNA evidence didn't match. The task force was back at square one. Breaking spirits. By the late 1990s, the sheer length of the investigation had begun to wear down even the most determined officers. Detectives left their families for weeks at a time to work the sprawling case, only to return home frustrated and empty-handed. Others retired, disillusioned, or transferred out, unwilling to keep chasing someone they believed they'd never catch. Veteran detective Frank Harris, a cornerstone of the investigation in its early days, retired in 1999. Speaking at his retirement party, he somberly told his colleagues, "I thought I'd close this case before I hung up my badge, but some monsters are just too good at hiding." The question that haunted everyone. The strain wore not only on the officers' spirits but their minds as well. Was the killer smarter than they'd anticipated, or had they overlooked something simple? Was it even one person responsible, or were multiple killers hunting women in Colorado's wilderness? A question that haunted the force for years could be captured in just one line. Were they chasing a man or a ghost? The Survivor, a turning point. For nearly 3 years, the elusive killer had managed to operate in the shadows, leaving a trail of bodies but no tangible leads. Law enforcement, bogged down by scant evidence and limited resources, faced a palpable sense of defeat. But in the fall of 1998, an unexpected break would come. Not from a piece of incriminating evidence, but from a woman who managed to survive an encounter with the predator. Her name was Emily Rogers, a 27-year-old teacher from Fort Collins who loved the outdoors. On an unassuming October afternoon, Emily decided to take one of her favorite hiking trails, heading deep into the woods just outside of town. The autumn air was brisk but refreshing, the golden leaves crunching under her boots as she walked. She'd been coming to these trails for years, finding peace among the towering pines and rustling leaves. But on this particular day, peace was nowhere to be found. Emily would later recount that she first noticed something unusual when the forest grew too quiet. No birds, no distant rustle of small animals, just an eerie stillness. Out of the corner of her eye she caught movement, the shadow of a man, standing too far from the trail for it to be casual. "I thought it was just somebody scouting or taking pictures," she would tell investigators. "I mean, this is Colorado, people hike all the time, but then I realized he wasn't moving." She quickened her pace, her heartbeat speeding up as her instincts screamed something wasn't right. It was then that the man emerged from the cover of the trees, stepping directly into her path. He was middle-aged, with dark, piercing eyes and an unsettling sense of calm. His clothes were nondescript: jeans, a flannel shirt, hiking boots. It could have been anyone. "He didn't look like a monster," Emily would later say in numerous interviews, "but there was something in his eyes that froze me." The man greeted her casually, claiming he'd gotten lost and was looking for directions back to the main trailhead. Emily hesitated. She noticed his boots were muddy, too muddy for someone who would have entered the woods near the trail. Before she could answer, he lunged. The attack was sudden and brutal, his hands closing over her throat as he dragged her off the trail into the dense undergrowth. Emily fought like hell. Despite the panic flooding her brain, instincts kicked in. She clawed at his face, kicking wildly, her boots colliding with his shins. At one point she managed to tear at his left cheek with her nails, drawing blood. He cursed, struck her hard across the face, and for a moment, Emily believed this would be the end. But then came the sound of distant voices, 2 other hikers, laughing and chatting, coming closer. The attacker froze. He hissed something under his breath that Emily never caught before, loosening his grip on her and bolting back into the trees. He vanished as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving Emily crumpled on the forest floor, her face swollen, her throat raw, and her heart pounding in terror. The hikers found Emily moments later, helping her stumble back down the trail to safety. She was rushed to a local hospital where she recounted the harrowing experience to authorities. Despite the bruises and abrasions on her body, Emily's sharp memory proved to be the most valuable asset in unraveling the mystery of Colorado's elusive serial killer. "I remember his voice," she told detectives. "It was low, like he didn't want to be heard by anyone else, but it had this Colorado drawl to it. He wasn't an outsider. This was somebody who's lived here for years." She provided a description: mid-40s, short brown hair, lean but strong frame. Her account was the first concrete profile of the killer law enforcement had ever received. But the most chilling revelation came when forensic analysts extracted DNA from the skin under Emily's fingernails. It was a match to the DNA found on 2 of the prior victims, confirming the nightmare that Emily's attacker and the elusive Colorado killer were one and the same. Strength in survival. What made Emily's survival so remarkable wasn't just her escape, it was her resilience afterward. Despite the trauma of the assault, Emily became a linchpin in the investigation, working tirelessly with law enforcement to piece together the murderer's habits. Her courage inspired other women in the area to come forward with stories of strange encounters in the woods, some eerily similar to hers. One woman mentioned seeing a man who fit Emily's description hanging around a remote gas station off Route 36, pacing and watching passing cars. Another recalled a similar encounter near a trailhead in Estes Park, where a man grew aggressive after she declined his offer to help carry her gear. None of these incidents had seemed critical until Emily's survival validated their worst fears. The killer was real and still out there. A shift in the investigation. Emily's testimony gave new energy to the investigation. The case, once stagnant, began picking up momentum. Artists created forensic sketches based on her description, plastering them across Colorado and neighboring states. Local news stations reported on Emily's bravery, calling her the woman who lived. Public awareness skyrocketed, flooding tip lines with sightings of suspicious individuals who resembled the composite sketch. For detectives like Captain Mitchell, Emily's survival meant hope. "She gave us something we'd never had before, a face to focus on, no matter how vague. It wasn't much, but it marked the first real shift in the case," he said in an interview years later. But for Emily, life would never truly return to normal. The woods she once loved had betrayed her, and the memories of that autumn day haunted her for years. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves was a reminder of the man who had nearly ended her life. "I survived," she told a journalist years later, "but a part of me is still out there on that trail wondering if he's coming back." Emily Rogers's encounter was not just a turning point in the investigation, it was a stark reminder of the fragility of safety in even the most serene places. Her endurance, however, served as a rallying cry for authorities and locals alike. The Colorado killer could bleed, and one way or another, he would be caught. A breakthrough from the DNA sample. By the early 2000s, the case of the elusive Colorado killer had gone stagnant. Public interest had waned, local law enforcement faced burnout, and even the task force launched with hopeful fanfare began to question whether this would become just another unsolved mystery in the annals of Colorado's dark history. But what they didn't realize was that technology, quietly advancing in labs and universities far from the haunting wilderness of the Rockies, was about to hand them a tool that would reignite the case in a way no one had anticipated. In 2003, a lingering piece of unprocessed evidence that had once seemed insignificant suddenly took on new potential. Beneath the thumbnail of the Boulder Canyon Jane Doe, the very first victim in this string of terror, investigators had previously found faint traces of skin cells. At the time, DNA analysis wasn't as sophisticated as it is today, and the material was considered too degraded for testing. But advancements in forensic science, especially in the extraction and amplification of DNA from trace samples, breathed fresh hope into the investigation. The evidence, stored carefully in a climate-controlled vault for years, was sent to a cutting-edge laboratory, one of only a handful in the country capable of using a process called mitochondrial DNA analysis, which could analyze even the tiniest, most fragmented bits of genetic material. For weeks, detectives felt the mounting tension of waiting. Was it possible that this tiny sliver of DNA held the answers they had been chasing for nearly a decade? When the results finally came in, the answer was yes, connecting the threads. The lab's analysis confirmed that the DNA under the victim's nail belonged to a male, and further testing found an exact match with the DNA recovered from two more victims, Emily Rogers' attacker and another victim in a murder near Phantom Canyon in 1997. It was, undoubtedly, the same person. This wasn't just any predator. It confirmed what investigators had feared all along: a serial killer was responsible. The connection wasn't just scientific, it was a timeline. The DNA not only proved the same killer had been active for years, but it also cemented the fact that he was meticulous. He had evaded capture in part due to the rugged geography, but also because he left next to nothing behind. No fingerprints, no shoe prints, no careless mistakes. And yet, in his violent attempt to subdue his first known victim, Jane Doe, he had made one slip, leaving just enough of himself under her nails to potentially unmask him. "This was the moment we'd been waiting for," said Detective Maria Ortega, who had joined the original task force in the late 90s and remained committed to the case. "We finally had evidence that didn't just tell us we had a killer, it told us we had a pattern, a thread connecting all these tragedies. Now we needed to pull on that thread to unravel the rest of him." The CODIS gamble. The next logical step was to enter the DNA profile into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database that housed the genetic profiles of convicted criminals. It had solved thousands of cold cases in the past decade, giving hope to families and law enforcement where none had existed before. Surely, investigators thought, a killer as experienced and bold as this one must have had some run-ins with the law. The DNA was entered, and the system churned through its database. Detectives held their breath, waiting for the name, the face, the file that would reveal their phantom to be nothing more than flesh and blood. But the screen returned a frustrating result: no matches found. The killer wasn't in CODIS. He had no known criminal record. For all his brutality, he had somehow kept himself off law enforcement's radar, or slipped through the cracks during prior investigations. The breakthrough, while monumental, brought with it another grim realization: they still didn't know who he was. "Getting no hits in CODIS was like hitting a brick wall full speed," said FBI agent Scott Hanley, who had joined the newly rejuvenated investigation after the DNA discovery. "We had the key, but no lock to open." Rebuilding momentum. With no name attached to the killer's DNA, investigators shifted focus. They began canvassing the communities where the murders occurred, collecting DNA from potential suspects in those areas. Warrants, voluntary samples, and even undercover efforts were carried out to gather swabs from individuals who might fit the profile. Every swab was a chance to finally pin down the man whose genetic fingerprint had mocked them for years. The DNA discovery also allowed detectives to narrow their suspect profile. Behavioral analysts at the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit ramped up their involvement, developing a clearer picture of who the killer might be. A middle-aged man with an intimate knowledge of Colorado's remote terrain, likely someone who held a job or hobby that gave him a reason to frequent the wilderness, maybe a park ranger, a survivalist, or even a hunter. He was controlled, patient, and knew how to avoid detection. The DNA told us who he was in the smallest, most fundamental way, Detective Ortega explained. Now we needed to figure out who he was in the real world. Where did he live? Where did he work? What bars did he drink at? Who did he talk to? He could be anyone. That was the most terrifying part of it. The suspect who got away. The breakthrough also revived long-simmering frustrations within the team. There had been a suspect back in 1998, a man named Alan Whitford, who fit much of the behavioral profile. A drifter with a history of violence and an affinity for off-grid living, Whitford had been detained for questioning near Phantom Canyon but ultimately released due to insufficient evidence. His DNA had since been compared against the samples from the killer, and the results confirmed his innocence. Whitford was innocent, but thinking about him made us paranoid, Agent Hanley admitted. How many other suspects had we overlooked? How many had slipped through our hands because we didn't have the technology at the time? A glimmer of hope. While the investigation slowed again, the DNA breakthrough planted a seed of hope that couldn't be erased. Each year, advancements in forensic genealogy and DNA databases fueled the belief that the killer would someday make a mistake. He could get arrested, submit a family member to a genealogy database, or leave behind another scrap of himself at a crime scene. Detectives held on to the discovery like a lifeline. The DNA didn't uncover the killer's identity, but it did something just as important. It confirmed his existence. He wasn't a ghost, a myth, or a legend spun out of fear and desperation. He was real, and his time would come. The string of crimes ends unexpectedly. By 2005, roughly a decade after the first body was discovered in Boulder Canyon, the killings that had haunted the wilderness of Colorado came to an unsettling halt. But this abrupt pause was as confounding to law enforcement as the crimes themselves. For years, a shadow had loomed over the state, culminating in at least a dozen young women missing or brutally murdered. Now, without warning, the predator seemed to have vanished, or worse, transformed into something even harder to trace. For investigators, the silence was deafening. Task force members gathered every few months to review cold files, combing through old notes and untested theories. Crime scenes that once carried the aftermath of violent brutality had gone quiet, trails went untouched, and the numbing flow of fresh reports had ceased. The frenzy of fear that had once gripped the public, keeping hikers off trails and would-be adventurers out of the backcountry, began to dissipate. But for detectives like Maria Ortega and Captain Mitchell, the lull was unnerving. It felt like a storm waiting to unravel. Killers like this don't just stop, Ortega told her colleagues during one of their regular briefings in 2006. A scatter of photographs, maps, and case briefs lay spread across the table between them. It's not in their nature. Either something's forced them to stop, or we're looking in the wrong direction. Speculation ran rampant inside the walls of law enforcement offices. Had the killer moved on to target victims elsewhere? Had he been incarcerated for another crime under an alias that had escaped detection? Or maybe he had died, a violent predator brought down by some unrelated act of fate. These were possibilities, all discussed in hushed, uneasy tones among the task force members. But each theory led to more questions than answers, and without evidence, they could do little more than speculate. The unnerving calm. The quiet was cold comfort to the community as well. For families of the victims, the absence of new crimes meant little compared to the pain of unresolved grief. Many of them, especially those whose daughters, sisters, and loved ones had disappeared, still held out hope that answers would emerge. Yet they were met with silence from officials who, while working tirelessly behind the scenes, had no breakthroughs to share. "I remember thinking," recalled Captain Mitchell, "is the killer watching us right now enjoying this? Did we spook him and he's lying low, or has he moved on? Found a new place to hunt?" Even the most seasoned detectives found themselves second-guessing their instincts about the case. Outside pressure on law enforcement dwindled as the years passed. The media, which had once plastered headlines like "The Colorado Strangler" across national outlets, turned its attention to newer stories. Public interest waned as newer cases gripped America's collective attention, leaving Colorado's terrifying saga to fade into a macabre corner of history. But for the task force and the victims' families, the lack of closure was suffocating. Lingering questions within the law enforcement community, theorizing about the killer's disappearance, became almost an obsession. Generations of criminal psychologists had studied the cooling-off period of serial offenders, periods where they managed to suppress or redirect their violent urges. However, what troubled investigators was the complete absence of any activity. There were no bodies found, no disappearances that matched the killer's pattern. It was as though the predator had dissolved, erased himself like fog in the morning sun. "I'd like to think we scared him off," said FBI agent Scott Hanley, who joined the Trail Hunter Task Force after the DNA breakthrough but saw its progress dwindle in the following years. But that's the thing about these guys. They don't scare easy. Some speculated that the killer might have been intimidated by advances in technology, such as forensic DNA tracing and growing databases like CODIS. Perhaps he had seen the writing on the wall with the DNA match from the Boulder Canyon Jane Doe, and decided to disappear before law enforcement got any closer. Others weren't so convinced. Another prevailing theory was that the killer didn't choose to stop, but was physically unable to continue. Maybe he was dead, succumbing to an accident in the same wilderness he once prowled, a fall off a rocky trail, an animal attack, even death by natural causes like a heart attack or stroke. Remote areas of Colorado claim lives every year, often leaving no more than skeletal remains scattered beyond recognition. Or, just as chilling, was the possibility that he was behind bars for an unrelated crime, his violent history unknown due to a lack of connection to the Colorado killings. This wasn't unheard of. Many serial murderers had gone unnoticed for years after being incarcerated for lesser offenses. A baffling pause. Psychologists offering their expertise to the case suggested other troubling scenarios. Could the predator have shifted his methods entirely, changed the way he selected victims, or moved to a completely different geographic location? Some killers learned from media coverage of their crimes, adapting their behaviors to escape detection. What if he had pivoted to targeting different types of victims, older women, homeless individuals, or transient populations that weren't as closely tracked in public databases? These unsettling thoughts prevented the Trail Hunter Task Force from standing down entirely. Though funding for the investigation waned with each passing year of inactivity, a small core of detectives stayed committed to keeping the case alive. "We weren't going to let bureaucratic silence kill this case," said Ortega. "Somewhere out there was the truth. Even if it felt out of reach, we couldn't forget what we were fighting for." The pause before the next move. By 2010, the Colorado wilderness felt safe again to most. New generations of outdoor enthusiasts, unaware, or unaffected by, the terror that had permeated the state only a decade earlier, returned to the forests and trails. Campgrounds bustled with laughter, families hiked without a second thought, and the shadow of fear seemed to lift. But a few locals remained wary. The families of the victims weren't convinced, nor were the detectives who had once sworn that they'd see this killer behind bars. "Some wounds," Mitchell said, now retired, reflecting on the long lapse, "don't heal easy. It's not the kind of silence you can celebrate." For law enforcement, unbeknownst to them, this eerie pause wasn't the ending they thought it might be. It wasn't closure at all. It was simply a chapter, a lull in the crescendo of violence that would make its ominous return more haunting than any of them could have imagined. A killer's shadow still looms. The string of crimes may have paused unexpectedly, but the killer's signature still lingered over every unsolved case. No body, no explanation, no new lead. Just the unsettling knowledge that somewhere out there, perhaps even among the wild pines and rocks of Colorado's rugged terrain, a predator was still lurking, waiting, watching. The unexpected return. The body in the national park. It had been more than a decade since the last confirmed victim of Colorado's elusive serial killer had been discovered. By 2016, the once terrifying chapter in the state's history had grown cold, filed away in dusty archives, where unsolved cases linger as grim reminders of justice undone. For a new generation of hikers and adventurers, the name Colorado Strangler barely held any weight, just a specter from the state's past. Trails and national parks were bustling again, reclaimed as safe havens of nature's beauty. But on an otherwise quiet morning in late June, that sense of safety was shattered. A group of tourists had been hiking near the remote reaches of Rocky Mountain National Park when they stumbled upon a scene that would reignite the ghost of Colorado's nightmare. Hidden just off a lightly traveled path, in an area more popular with seasoned wilderness explorers than casual tourists, was the body of a young woman. Partially concealed by pine needles and underbrush, her lifeless figure lay sprawled among the rocks. Authorities would later report the unsettling detail that her body had been deliberately posed, a subtle but chilling signature that officers hadn't seen in over a decade. The park ranger who arrived to cordon off the scene tried hard to control his visible unease. There was something too still about the whole area, he later described to investigators. The way the body was lying, the way the animals hadn't even touched it despite the remoteness. It didn't feel like a freak accident or a hiker in trouble. It felt like someone was sending a message. Eerie similarities. When the National Park Service called in local law enforcement, it was initially classified as a suspicious death. The victim, later identified as Mia Flores, a 26-year-old travel blogger from New Mexico, had been reported missing by friends just 3 days earlier. She had been hiking alone, documenting her journey through the Colorado wilderness for her growing online audience. Her last known location had been posted on social media just the evening before her disappearance, a cheerful selfie taken near a trailhead not far from where her body would eventually be found. But the moment forensic investigators arrived, the similarities with the Colorado killer's previous victims were impossible to ignore. Ligature marks darkened her neck. Authorities noted that her hands were crossed delicately over her chest, an unmistakable positioning seen in nearly every confirmed victim from the 1990s and early 2000s. Mia's belongings, camera, backpack, wallet, were missing, leaving no immediate clues as to what had occurred or where. For Detective Maria Ortega, who was called back from another case due to her extensive history on the original task force, it was like stepping back in time. When I saw the crime scene photos, I couldn't believe it. It was just too familiar. It was him, Ortega said in an emotional interview years later. That was the moment I knew we weren't dealing with someone from history. He was still out there. DNA, a decade-old signature, returns. It didn't take long for forensic investigators to confirm what many in the department already suspected. Traces of DNA were recovered from the scene, meticulously swabbed from beneath the victim's fingernails. The forensic lab that had once been thought of as a secondary partner on an old cold case now became the focal point of urgency. Days of silence passed, investigators holding their breath, knowing that an answer, any answer, might not only break open Mia's case but reignite over a decade's worth of stalled investigations. When the results returned, it was as though the past had come hurtling into the present. The DNA matched. It was an exact match to the evidence gathered in the original Colorado killings, linking Mia Flores unequivocally to the same predator who had stalked and terrorized the state's wilderness so many years ago. Seeing that match confirmed was like being punched in the gut, said FBI agent Scott Hanley. It wasn't relief, it wasn't excitement, it was fear, because it meant we hadn't been dealing with the end of something, we'd been dealing with a pause. Rekindling the hunt. The discovery of Mia's body, and the horrifying revelation that the killer had resurfaced, shook law enforcement to its core. The question that hung over every briefing, every press conference, every hushed conversation between detectives was the same. Why now? Why had the killer gone silent for so long, only to emerge over a decade later to strike again? Speculation ran rampant. Had the killer grown older, taking fewer risks with age, but felt compelled to strike again out of some obsessive psychological need? Had he been lying low, possibly incarcerated during the long lapse in activity, only recently released? Or had Mia Flores been a case of sheer calculated opportunity, a perfect victim in a remote location, too tempting for a predator to resist? That's what haunted me the most, Detective Ortega admitted. The idea that he didn't stop out of remorse. He stopped for his own reasons, his own convenience, and when it suited him again, he picked right back up where he left off. The media descended on Colorado with the same frenzy as years before, headlines screaming of the return of the Colorado Strangler and reopening the wounds of families who had never received closure. For the members of the original task force, many of whom were retired or working different cases, it was a bittersweet return to the nightmare that had consumed their lives years earlier. A heightened threat. What terrified investigators most was the knowledge that the killer's long hiatus could mean anything. He might still be the same methodical, calculated predator who had once seemingly chosen his victims with care, But he also could have become sloppier, potentially more dangerous, driven by urgency or instability. Mia's case had proven beyond a doubt that the killer was still capable, and still willing to operate in the same starkly remote areas of Colorado's wilderness. "This man is a ghost," FBI agent Hanley said during a grim press conference. "But he's a ghost that's left a trail, and mark my words, we're going to follow it." Behind closed doors, the consensus among law enforcement was unanimous. This wasn't just a return, it was a declaration. The predator hadn't gone away. He had been waiting, calculating the right moment to re-enter the hunt, and now, the cat-and-mouse game had begun again, only with the stakes higher than ever. Back to the forest. The legacy of the Colorado killings hung heavier than ever, weighing down not just the task force but the wilderness itself. Campgrounds emptied, trails once bustling with tourists went quiet, and warnings from park rangers were issued in rapid succession. For many locals, the brief peace they had grown accustomed to was shattered, replaced once again with the unease of watching the tree line for shadows. For law enforcement, Mia Flores's death wasn't just another tragedy, it was a second chance to bring a monster to justice. The Trail Hunter Task Force, dormant but never dismantled, rose from the ashes, this time armed with years of forensic advancements, updated profiling techniques, and an unrelenting determination. If the killer had returned, so had they. The ambush and creative operation. By 2017, with the murder of Mia Flores still fresh in the public's mind and the harrowing knowledge that the Colorado killer was active once more, law enforcement found itself at a critical crossroads. Decades of chasing dead ends, sporadic leads, and tantalizing theories had taken their toll on the officers and agents involved. But Mia's death offered something they hadn't had in over 10 years. Momentum. The quieter years seemed to have lulled the killer into a false sense of security, and now he'd left them with another body, another thread to follow, and one undeniable conclusion: he could be caught. But they also knew the fences had tightened. This was no ordinary criminal. They were dealing with someone precise, intelligent, and terrifyingly patient. At a time when most serial killers were caught by their own recklessness, this predator adapted with incredible foresight. Nearly vanishing into the wilderness, he treated like his kingdom. The task force understood that they could not rely on waiting for him to slip up on a technicality. The killer himself would have to be lured out. That's when the idea of the ambush was born, laying the foundation, a game of bait and patience. The FBI decided to do what the killer had done for decades, use the wilderness to their advantage. They brainstormed a strategy combining technology, psychology, and good old-fashioned legwork to create an operation unlike anything attempted in the hunt for this elusive figure. Dubbed Operation Trail Hunter, after the original task force name, the plan focused on baiting the killer into making his next move, not in an uncontrolled environment, but inside an elaborate trap of their design. The background research began with patterns, the killer's history of targeting women in isolated trails, campsites, and less-traveled corners of the wilderness. Behavioral analysts identified that he preferred specific kinds of victims, women between their 20s and early 30s, often hiking solo, traveling through off-grid areas, or living transient lifestyles. His methods demonstrated he had a deep familiarity not only with human psychology, but also with wilderness survival. Such patterns were critical in planning the operation. The trap's key component, a team of undercover female agents chosen not only for their skills in fieldwork, but for their willingness to step into the lion's den. Posing as out-of-state hikers, campers, and even sex workers, these agents would frequent areas similar to those targeted by the killer in the past. Their goal was simple, but risky: to draw his attention, preparing the field. The operation required months of planning, resources, and sheer creativity. Colorado's expansive wilderness could often feel like an accomplice to the killer. Its size and natural chaos turned every square mile into a potential hiding spot. But this time, law enforcement fired back with equal cunning. Drones outfitted with the latest thermal imaging and night vision cameras were deployed across popular trailheads, backcountry campsites, and state parks. Each trailhead was assigned a surveillance team equipped with the best portable monitoring systems available, able to disguise themselves as campers, park rangers, or forestry workers without raising suspicion. In addition, teams worked closely with volunteer hikers, guiding them through the region while fitting them with trackers and covert microphones. The key here was to saturate the areas the killer might scout without disrupting their natural appearance. If he was watching, they wanted him to see nothing but business as usual on the surface, while unaware he was already walking into the jaws of the trap. "We knew he was deliberate," said Agent Scott Hanley, one of the operation coordinators. "This wasn't someone who'd go after the wrong person in a blind rush. He's calculated. If he decided to show himself, it meant he thought everything was in his control. That's what we were banking on, his arrogance." Undercover bait. Danger in disguise. The most daring element of the operation was the placement of undercover agents in highly vulnerable roles. Agent Sarah McConnell, a field expert with experience in deep cover infiltration, volunteered to take one of the riskiest missions. Her cover? A solo hiker traveling cross-country to document her adventures. Equipped with a hidden microphone, a tracker embedded in her hiking boots, and a knife disguised as a carabiner, Sarah became the centerpiece of the operation's bait plan. But Sarah wasn't alone. Rotating shifts of undercover agents worked parallel to her, posing as solo female travelers in segments of the wilderness where the killer might strike. Some played drifters or free-spirited hikers, casually chatting with fellow campers at trailhead coffee stands and inconspicuously distributing their presence along key routes. Others blazed solo paths through remote areas wearing visible GPS information tags, an intentional choice to gauge whether the killer might observe and target what seemed to be too much technology, a tactic previously associated with his avoidance of monitored victims. "It's hard to describe what it's like walking into a trap you yourself designed," Sarah admitted in an interview years later. "Even knowing you're surrounded by surveillance doesn't make it feel safer. The thought that this guy could be watching from just beyond the tree line, it's a special kind of fear, let me tell you." Playing with time and shadows. Weeks turned into months. Agents rotated in and out of duty, swapping covers and blending into small Colorado towns. Locals, many of whom suffered under the previous reign of terror, were skeptical at first, but eventually, with enough polite listening and subtle recruiting, the task force secured help from those living closest to the trails. Despite that, the killer remained elusive. Each day passed with law enforcement closer to doubting themselves. Had he already moved to another state? Was he watching from some distant perch, laughing at their efforts? Was he still alive? Sarah and her colleagues remained on high alert, determined to stay patient. "The thing about men like him," Sarah explained, "is they watch. They wait. This game isn't quick for them. So while it wears on you, every second without action, it also reminds you he's out there, somewhere, waiting for what he thinks is the perfect moment." The creative twist, turning fear against him. The task force also turned to psychology to put the killer on edge. Publicly, they released vague but pointed statements to the press, announcing that new forensic evidence had surfaced, though withholding specifics, that law enforcement was closer to an arrest than ever. Expert profilers advised that men like the Colorado killer tended to have an inflated sense of intelligence, and this kind of messaging could provoke him, push him toward taking risks he normally wouldn't. It worked. A series of strange sightings began to filter in across the national park system. A man loitering near parking lots late at night, a shadowy figure allegedly spotted watching female campers from a ridge. One report even came from a trail cam video showing a lone man moving through the woods carrying what appeared to be cables, a chilling image that mirrored the killer's choice of ligatures in earlier crimes. "He started tripping over himself," Hanley chuckled. "Something finally scared him enough to make mistakes. Little ones, but mistakes nonetheless." The suspect emerges, a man once beyond suspicion. By 2018, the momentum that law enforcement had been building over the past year in the hunt for Colorado's elusive killer finally came to a head. It had been over 2 decades since the first body was discovered in Boulder Canyon, and while the murders spanned generations, the investigators chasing this phantom had always held on to one hope, that one small mistake, one overlooked clue, might finally reveal the face behind the shadow. That moment had come. What many didn't expect was that the man who emerged as a suspect was someone who had been questioned years earlier, and released. A man who had slipped through the cracks, hiding his true nature behind the mask of an ordinary life. His name was George Bowen, and on the surface he seemed to be no one special. George was a 54-year-old construction worker living in a modest house just outside of Denver. He was quiet, solitary, and unassuming, a man who had lived much of his adult life flying just under the radar. He had no significant criminal record, just a few minor infractions from his younger years that most people had long forgotten. And yet, when his DNA was analyzed in 2018, It was a perfect match to the genetic material recovered from multiple crime scenes tied to the killer. For the members of the Trail Hunter Task Force, this discovery wasn't just shocking, it was infuriating. Bowen had been investigated nearly 2 decades earlier during the initial wave of murders in the late 1990s. His name had come up after being seen loitering near a hiking trail where one of the victims had last been spotted. At the time, police spoke with him, even brought him in for questioning, but they couldn't find enough evidence to hold him. Back then, DNA technology wasn't what it is today, and Bowen had enough charisma and enough alibis to talk his way out of being a serious suspect. Looking back, it's hard not to feel like we missed something, admitted Detective Maria Ortega, who had worked the case since its inception. He wasn't on anyone's radar because he didn't fit the mold of what we were looking for. He looked too normal, but killers like this, they're good at that. They survive by being invisible. The DNA match that changed everything. The break came not from Bowen voluntarily giving his DNA but rather through a routine familial search in a third-party genealogy database. In 2018, the FBI and state law enforcement began turning to these public databases to solve cold cases, using the DNA left at crime scenes to match against distant relatives of potential suspects. When the DNA profile of the Colorado killer was uploaded, it wasn't Bowen who initially matched, it was a second cousin, whose genetic markers partially aligned with the DNA left beneath the thumbnail of the Boulder Canyon Jane Doe. Investigators then backtracked, piecing together Bowen's family tree until the match led them directly to George Bowen's front door. The breakthrough left some investigators elated and others downright furious. Bowen had been right in front of them before. It wasn't as if he had disappeared like so many other suspects had. He had continued living a quiet life, even marrying for a time, though the relationship ended after just a few years when his wife left, citing emotional distance and anger issues. He kept to himself, blending into small-town Colorado life as though nothing had ever happened. "What pissed me off the most," said Agent Scott Hanley, "was the idea that he probably thought we were amateurs, that we overlooked him, that his little act worked. But you know what? Arrogant bastards like him always slip up eventually." And he did. Tracing his double life. The more police dug into Bowen's life, the more disturbingly ordinary he appeared. He lived alone, working sporadically on construction jobs that took him to remote areas across the state. He wasn't particularly close to his extended family, and he didn't seem to have a wide circle of friends. Co-workers described him as quiet and a bit strange, but nothing that raised red flags. He wasn't the brooding loner or the hyper-charismatic figure often associated with serial killers. Bowen's power came from how unremarkable he appeared. However, beneath this ordinary facade was a man who thrived on control and meticulous planning. Investigators discovered that Bowen was an avid outdoorsman, often camping in remote areas, sometimes for weeks at a time. He would tell colleagues and neighbors it was a way to clear his head, but detectives knew better. Those trips weren't about peace, they were about hunting. Detective Ortega described him as a man who understood how to disappear into the wilderness. Bowen had intimate knowledge of Colorado's sprawling forests and isolated trails, where he knew he could ambush his victims unseen. His construction work allowed him to travel regularly, providing him with a mobile lifestyle perfect for someone who needed to stay ahead of police. As investigators revisited the original crime scenes, they saw Bowen's methods in sharper detail. He didn't just choose remote areas at random. He knew them intimately, scouting them out, waiting for the right moment. Victims like Mia Flores and the numerous others before her weren't picked by chance. They were carefully selected. Timing, location, and opportunity were everything to Bowen, building the case. Once the DNA match was confirmed, the task force wasted no time obtaining a warrant to covertly monitor Bowen. Surveillance teams watched his every move, documenting his routines and collecting secondary evidence to ensure their case against him wouldn't fall apart in court. His trash was checked for DNA, his vehicle was tracked, and undercover agents quietly shadowed him on his frequent camping trips. What they found only strengthened the case. In Bowen's truck, police discovered lengths of nylon rope consistent with the ligatures used in the murders, along with a detailed map of Colorado's hiking trails, many of which directly overlapped locations where the victims were found. Surveillance footage showed him buying camping supplies at odd hours, disappearing into the woods for days at a time with no clear explanation. When we started piecing it together, it was like looking at a puzzle that had been missing half its pieces for 20 years, Hanley admitted grimly. Everything about him made sense. His movement patterns, his job, his personality. He wasn't some enigma anymore, he was a predator hiding in plain sight. The arrest. On a chilly morning in November 2018, a team of officers quietly surrounded Bowen's home. The arrest was tactical and swift, befitting the years of work that had gone into catching him. Bowen initially denied everything, maintaining the air of a quiet, confused man who couldn't understand why the police were targeting him. But as soon as he was informed of the DNA match, his demeanor shifted. He just went cold, Ortega recounted. You could see it in his eyes. He knew the game was over. Law enforcement would later find additional evidence in his home, items that strongly linked him to several victims, including personal belongings he had kept as trophies. To those who had worked the case for years, the discovery of these gruesome mementos was both devastating and validating. Bowen hadn't just killed, he had kept pieces of his victims to relive his crimes, possibly for years after he stopped murdering. The man who fooled them all. For a community haunted by decades of uncertainty, Bowen's arrest was a watershed moment. But even as his name and face became public, there was a lingering unease. How many more were out there like him? Ordinary men living mundane lives, their darkness hidden just beneath the surface. Bowen's arrest wasn't just the end of a long manhunt, it was a reckoning, a reminder that the quietest among us can sometimes carry the loudest horrors. The shocking confession. Once in custody, George Bowen maintained a cold, resolute silence while detectives scrambled to build an airtight case. For days he sat in the gray interview room of the county jail, his hands cuffed in the most unremarkable pose imaginable. Calm, stoic, and maddeningly emotionless, Bowen answered early questions with either short, ambiguous phrases or total indifference. To the untrained ear, he might have come off as confused, a simple man bewildered by the accusations. But seasoned detectives like Maria Ortega knew better. Bowen wasn't confused, he was calculating. You could see it in his steady eyes, his still posture. He was biding his time, Ortega recalled later. Like he thought he would outlast us, like we couldn't crack him. But we knew if we pushed just hard enough, if we found the right angle, we could make him talk. It would take nearly a week of relentless questioning, strategic pressure and psychological tactics before the veneer began to crack. The story Bowen ultimately told wasn't just chilling, it was beyond anything law enforcement had expected. Breaking the silence. The breakthrough came after investigators started confronting Bowen with hard evidence. Surveillance footage, reports from past scenes, and eventually the DNA match connecting him to multiple victims, all carefully laid out in front of him like an intricate chessboard. For each move they made, Bowen's mask of composure shrank just slightly. The cracks formed not in the presentation of high-tech forensic evidence, but in the human element. Detective Ortega and her partner, Agent Scott Hanley, did something Bowen wasn't used to. They talked about the victims as people. They described their names, their lives, their families. They spoke about Mia Flores and how her parents had cried when they saw her last Instagram post, or how the Boulder Canyon Jane Doe had remained nameless to this day, a ghost haunting the memories of all who worked her case. At first, Bowen reacted with disdain. His expression would tighten, and he would look away, his jaw clenching as though physically locking words inside his mouth. But the photos broke through. Images of bruised necks, lifeless bodies staged in surreal postures, the horrifying remnants of Bowen's rage were laid out on the table one by one. For every victim there was something Bowen couldn't ignore. Field notes showed meticulous details of his work, details only the killer could know. That, coupled with the DNA evidence that tied him to everything, made any resistance futile. The first words he spoke? A flat, emotionless whisper. 11. There were 11 of them. The admission. When Bowen finally uncorked the horror buried inside him, it didn't come as some cathartic breakdown, nor did it arrive with remorse. It came casually, as if he were reciting facts from a textbook that no longer mattered to him. Of the 11 women whose lives he took over the span of 2 decades, Bowen couldn't remember every name. When pressed, he admitted it was because he never cared to know them. What I remember is how they looked, Bowen said dryly, his voice devoid of emotion. How they walked, the way they didn't see me coming, that's what stuck with me. Detective Ortega would later recall how her blood turned to ice at those words. It was like he was describing a game he had mastered, no regret, no anger. He'd dehumanized them so completely it almost seemed unreal. At one point during the confession, Hanley asked the question on everyone's mind. Why? Bowen stared blankly at him for a long moment before leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "Because they thought they were safe," he said. "Out there in the middle of nowhere they all thought they were safe. But people like me, we're the real wilderness. We're what they should have been afraid of. A lifetime of hate." As the confession unfolded, it became clear that Bowen's crimes weren't spontaneous acts of violence. They were deeply rooted in a lifetime of internal rage. He revealed that his hatred for women had been building from a young age, shaped by years of personal inadequacy, rejection, and bitterness. These feelings were exacerbated during his brief stint in the military, where he claimed female superiors had humiliated him, labeling him as weak. Then there was the betrayal. Bowen described with chilling clarity the unraveling of his first and only marriage, a relationship he called a parade of disappointments. His wife left him after just 3 years, citing his violent temper and erratic behavior. But Bowen didn't see it that way. To him it was a deliberate smear on his pride, an insult that festered like an open wound for years. "You think it's just about them?" Bowen sneered during the interrogation. "It wasn't just the women who hurt me. When they walked through those woods, so sure they'd never meet someone like me, they had to learn, they had to see." Methodical madness, perhaps the most appalling part of Bowen's confession was the meticulous care he took in selecting his victims. He told detectives about the weeks, sometimes months, he would spend stalking potential targets. From parking lots near trailheads to campsites tucked deep into remote forests, Bowen knew the terrain better than any park ranger. "It was never random," he admitted with a smirk. "I watched them, I waited. You only get one shot, so it has to be the right moment." The moments Bowen described were groomed to perfection. He would study his victims' routines, learn their habits, and track their movements until he could predict when they'd be the most vulnerable. His favorite tactic was to approach under false pretenses, offering directions, warning of wild animals spotted nearby, or simply asking for help. His charm wasn't overplayed, it was just enough to lower their guard. And then he would strike, always with precision, always in silence. No remorse. Despite the overwhelming brutality of his crimes, Bowen exhibited no remorse during the confession. He spoke not of guilt or regret, but of inevitability, as if he'd played a role he couldn't escape. "It was going to happen," he stated plainly. "I was just the one willing to do it." Ortega and Hanley pressed him on whether he ever felt guilty. Why stop in 2005? Why the hiatus? For the first time Bowen shrugged. "I got tired," he admitted. "It wasn't the same anymore. The excitement, once you've done it that many times it loses its thrill. But then," he paused, his lips curling into a grim half-smile, "when I saw her." He was talking about Mia Flores, the travel blogger, her social media posts, her last selfie near the trailhead, the way she fit his perfect victim profile. "She was like a sign," Bowen said. "I guess you could call her nostalgic." A killer unmasked. For investigators, Bowen's confession was as much of a victory as it was a haunting window into the mind of a predator. He recounted every detail with a level of detachment that nearly broke the room. There was no remorse in his words, no humanity in his voice. When asked why he was confessing now, Bowen shrugged again. "You already know," he said simply. "The rest is just a formality, isn't it?" As he was led back to his cell, Ortega couldn't help but feel the weight of what she had seen and heard. "We had caught the man," she said later, "but there was no undoing what he'd left behind. It wasn't just the bodies, it was the shadows he cast over these places, these woods. He'd taken away the safety of the wilderness, and for people like that, confession doesn't mean redemption, it never will." Lessons and justice. In December of 2020, George Bowen sat in a packed courtroom under fluorescent lights that felt both too bright and too dim for what was taking place. Outside, snow fell quietly on the streets of Denver, blanketing the city in an eerie, muffling silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Inside the courthouse, silence had a weight of its own. Victims' families filled the gallery, their faces etched with grief, anger, and a hint of exhaustion. They had waited decades for this moment, for justice to finally be served. The air was thick with tension as the judge delivered the sentence. By now, the verdict was no surprise: death. After weeks of shocking testimonies, forensic evidence, and Bowen's unemotional admission to taking the lives of 11 women, the jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours. The death penalty wasn't just a sentence, it was an emphatic end to one of Colorado's darkest chapters. But as the gavel came down, there wasn't a sense of triumph, no victorious cheers or sighs of relief. Instead, there was an enduring weight that lingered, as heavy as the snowfall outside. For many, law enforcement, prosecutors, and especially the families, justice didn't feel like closure. It felt like something much more fragile, the first step in understanding an unimaginable legacy of fear and trauma. The long road to Justice Bowen's trial had become a media circus, with reporters from across the nation descending on Colorado to document the decades-long hunt for one of modern America's most elusive killers. His calm demeanor during the trial only made the proceedings more unnerving. Bowen never flinched as witnesses described the destruction he had caused. He showed no reaction as forensic experts laid out the meticulous methods he had used to track, ambush, and kill his victims. He didn't see them as people, Maria Ortega, now retired, explained to reporters during a feature-length documentary about the case. To Bowen, these women were objects, challenges, trophies, something to conquer. That's why prosecuting him wasn't just about punishing what he'd done, it was about forcing him to face what he never cared to see, the humanity of the lives he destroyed. Ortega, once a young detective pushing through roadblocks in the late 90s, had attended every day of the trial. For her, it wasn't just about justice, it was about closure. She had stood over too many crime scenes, stared at too many hollowed-out faces of victims who would never go home. Watching Bowen shuffle into the courtroom, shackled and powerless, was a stark contrast to the specter he had been in the woods. For the first time, he wasn't in control. There were no shadows for him to hide in. And yet, for all the evidence presented and all the survivor impact statements read aloud in court, Bowen's reaction remained the same. Empty. Detached. It was as though we were prosecuting a ghost, one prosecutor said during a post-trial interview. You expect a shred of humanity, regret, anger, something, but with him, it was really like he'd severed that part of himself a long time ago. Lessons learned. The Bowen case wasn't just about holding one man accountable for decades of terror, it became a case study for law enforcement nationwide. Many began looking inward, questioning how someone like Bowen could slip through the cracks for so long. We weren't ready for someone like him, FBI agent Scott Hanley admitted candidly at a law enforcement conference the following year. When Bowen first came onto our radar in the 90s, we were hunting killers who fit different molds. Guys like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy. They were flashy, they left trails. But Bowen? He adapted. He used the wilderness as his weapon. He taught us how vulnerable the system really is when you have a predator who knows how to disappear. One of the greatest lessons highlighted by the case was the critical role of DNA and forensic genealogy. When Bowen slipped through law enforcement's fingers in the late 90s, the technology simply wasn't there to connect the dots. It was the advent of public genealogy databases, paired with advancements in modern DNA analysis, that ultimately led to his capture. Without those breakthroughs, we wouldn't even be having this conversation, Hanley continued. We'd still be sitting in meeting rooms, staring at maps of Colorado trails, wondering if he was still out there. And that's terrifying to think about. The Bowen case led to sweeping changes in how serial crimes were investigated. Regulations for sharing forensic data across counties were tightened, interagency collaboration was prioritized, and wilderness surveillance techniques underwent multi-million-dollar upgrades. But for many officers and agents, the hardest lesson was more personal. It made me question everything, said one investigator who spent years on the Trail Hunter Task Force. Did we miss others like him? Were there other bodies we never found? How many killers survive because they blend into their environments waiting for us to misstep? The shadow Bowen left behind. The families of the 11 known victims walked away from the trial with bittersweet emotions. Many gave interviews afterward, speaking about the impossible journey of grappling with loss for so many years without answers. For some, Bowen's conviction brought a sense of resolution. For others, it stoked the pain of memories they had tried to bury. You think you'll feel better when the trial's finally over? Said Linda Dawson, whose daughter vanished on a morning jog in 1998. You tell yourself, it'll be done. You'll have answers. But it doesn't really end. He's still there. You still ask yourself, why her? Why not someone else? And there's no answer for that. I don't think there ever will be. Even the wilderness itself seemed scarred by Bowen's legacy. Trails that had once welcomed hikers with open arms now carried an unshakable stigma. A generation of locals still hesitated to wander too far from the main roads. National parks struggled to reassure tourists that their lands were safe. Colorado's vast beauty, once synonymous with freedom and adventure, had been tainted by decades of Bowen's secret hunts. I still look at the trees differently, confessed Sarah McConnell, the undercover agent who had posed as hiker bait in the ambush operation. They're beautiful, yes, but you know better now. The tree line isn't just peaceful, it can hide something, someone, and for me, it always will. The duality of Justice Bowen's death sentence marked a chapter's close in Colorado's history, but it also reignited debates about the nature of justice in cases like his. Was the death penalty enough for someone who had created so much suffering? Could there ever be a punishment severe enough to account for the pain he caused? For law enforcement, the sentencing brought a sense of vindication. They had spent decades chasing a phantom, and finally, the man behind the shadow would pay for his crimes. But for many, as Captain Harold Mitchell once said, justice and healing aren't the same thing. Law professors around the country began using the Bowen case as an example of everything from forensic innovation to the philosophy of punishment. Meanwhile, podcasts, books, documentaries, and college courses all dissected the case, studying why it had taken so long to catch Bowen and how he had managed to elude capture for so many years. He became a villain whose story would haunt criminological studies for decades to come. A final reflection. For those closest to the case, detectives, agents, and families, the emotional scars remained. Even with Bowen stripped of his power and locked away, the memories of the trails, the victims, and the years of not knowing refused to fade. For years, every stumble on a quiet backcountry trail or site of an abandoned campsite would bring Bowen back to life in their minds. It wasn't just about the bodies, Ortega mused later in retirement. It was what he represented. He took something sacred, nature, solitude, and turned it into something terrifying. That's his shadow. That's what lingers. But amidst the pain was an undeniable truth. Bowen had been caught. The system, flawed as it was, had worked. Behind bars, stripped of his freedom and his tools, Bowen would never hunt again. Even in the face of unimaginable tragedies, the lessons learned and the relentless pursuit of justice proved one thing above all else: monsters like Bowen don't win in the end.